There's been a lot of recent talk saying that intermittent fasting is not sustainable, that it's extreme. And because it's extreme, it's definitely not going to be something that people can do for a really long period of time. And when you look at the data, it seems to be one of the best that people can adhere to. And there was a relatively new study that looked at a number of different things. I did another video on it talking about how it impacts visceral belly fat, how it impacted glucose, whatever. But it compares this to a moderately low carb diet, not a super low carb diet, not keto, but like a diet that's like 130 grams of carbs. And the results are quite interesting when it comes down to sustainability, but it opens up some other questions that I think we should address. So let's dive in. After today's video, if you're fasting, I highly recommend you consume electrolytes when you're fasting. It just makes fasting easier, but it's also a good thing to do because as your insulin levels drop with fasting, you end up excreting more water, which means you lose more minerals as well. And losing water is one thing, but when you start losing minerals, it's harder to rehydrate. So I put a link down below for LMNT Electrolytes. They're a sponsor on this channel, but that's also going to get you a free variety sample pack of all their different flavors with any purchase. So if you use that link, it's down below. It's drinklmnt.com/Thomas. I highly recommend you try the citrus salt. It tastes like a Sprite, but totally flat, right? Without the carbonation. So it's perfect. It just feels like you're getting something that tastes darn good and is refreshing as well. So that link down below gets you that free variety pack with any purchase. So this study was published in Cell Reports, and I'm gonna flash forward directly to the sustainability portion because the adherence is so important. So what this study looked at is it looked at a low carb diet, which in this case was 130 grams of carbs, which is low enough to be considered low carb. It's not keto, but it can be low carb. Then there is intermittent fasting ad libitum. So eating whatever they wanted to, really however much they wanted to, for 3 months. And then there was intermittent fasting plus low carb combined. And then they broke down the fasting groups into further ETRF, where they fasted in the evening but ate in the morning, or LTRF, where they fasted through breakfast and ate in the evening. This was quite interesting. The best adherence was the intermittent fasting group with carbohydrates, like totally ad libitum. That was more sustainable and had better adherence than a moderately low carb diet where they could eat whenever they wanted to. 130 grams of carbs is low, but not so low where people feel like they're deprived of anything. And like most people would say, okay, well that's like a paleo style, almost zone type diet, maybe a little less than zone. Like that should be sustainable, but intermittent fasting is the one that gets the finger pointed at it all the time because it's extreme and not sustainable. When in reality, it was the highest adherence. People lasted on average 66 days compared to 55 days. But what's interesting is when they combined intermittent fasting and low carb, 18% of people ended up saying, I can't go on with this, versus 1% of people saying, I can't go on with this with regular intermittent fasting. That's a big difference. So what we're seeing here is that as you start to stack diet rules, that's when you run into problems. Now I have a theory. And this is my approach, and you may not like it, you may like it, but whatever. When you start to add a bunch of different variables for simple caloric restriction, you run into problems. So with basic caloric restriction, we know it works. Yes, it works. The problem is to get there, you're looking at all these different things to try to reduce calories. Oh, let me add fiber here. Let me add protein here. Oh, let me add that little thing because it's got a lot of food volume. All which are great tips, things I talk about. I give these tools. But if there's 100 different things that you have to remember, then yeah, that's going to be hard. The benefit with intermittent fasting is that it's black and white and you don't have to think about that stuff. That takes energy up here. That takes so much drive and prefrontal cortex like horsepower that you can only willpower your way through that for so long before you're burnt out. So here we are trying to shoot people down saying that intermittent fasting is extreme and not sustainable, when in reality, as far as what our brain can handle, it's probably the easiest because you don't have to remember one thing. I don't eat at this time and I eat at this time. So if you start putting restrictions on fasting, like, hey, don't eat this, don't eat that, although it might be the better way to fast, like strategically, it might not be the most sustainable way if you're just looking at caloric restriction. Now, I've talked about this in another video, but I'm going to mention it here. You know which diet out of these three, intermittent fasting, ad lib, flexible, intermittent fasting plus low carb versus low carb, which one had the best belly fat reduction as far as visceral fat, inflammatory visceral fat? Guess. The intermittent fasting ad libitum. It did better than intermittent fasting plus low carb, and it did better than low carb alone. And what this tells us is that maybe they were more adhered to it, maybe they were sticking to it. But also, maybe they were getting enough food volume that they were satiated because they got some fruit, they got some veggies, and they weren't just adding in fats for fat's sake to try to get calories in. Glucose control was better amongst all groups, so we know that they're all good for controlling glucose. We have to remember that sustainability is the most important thing, because most people need it. Now, if you're watching this channel and you're a veteran of this channel, you might be someone that's a little more detail-oriented, and you might get excited about those multiple bricks in the wall like I do. Okay, but that's almost an advanced tier. And when people look at my channel, I understand that there is a big gap between the new person that comes in that's just trying to get healthy and learn, compared to the person that's been watching my videos for 7 or 8 years and is like, okay, I want another tool, I want another tool, I want another tool. When you're first starting out, sustainability is the most important thing, and you build that root. Stop listening to the people that tell you that intermittent fasting is extreme, because it's only extreme if you make it extreme. If it's a simple tool that you use for sustainability and caloric restriction, it's arguably one of the most powerful tools, and the data is there to support it, because it is just as good as caloric restriction, possibly even better in some ways, because of the timing. It's just as good, if not better, plus it's got a heck of a lot of counts of sustainability. So as always, keep it locked into my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.